So this is our reading group, continuing our reading of the problems, cybernetics and information, cybernetics and the origin of information. There we go, getting the name right. We're on the additional chapter in the 1967 second edition. So it's the title is The Problems of Cybernetics in 1967. Yeah, so this chapter is, to some extent, it's kind of like a condensation of the whole sort of first edition of the book, but a lot of it has to do with sort of the developments in cybernetics and in information technology over the intervening, I guess, 13 years since the first edition. Yeah, maybe what we looked at last time is what we can go over a little bit. So he talked about the sort of continuity or the sort of gradual transition between something like correcting or filling in on the one hand, and then indentation on the other hand. So he talks about like these or like one example he gives is like when you write a sentence in a natural language, a human language like English or French, there's always a certain amount of redundancy in the sense that like his example is where you sort of leave off the plural ending of a verb in French, but the fact that the subject is plural allows you to sort of reconstruct the plural ending that the verb is supposed to have. So like in the grammatically constructed French sentence, you have the plural marked on the article, the noun that is the subject, and also on the end of the verb. So missing one of those, you can still sort of fill in the missing one. And you have the same thing in English with different grammatical constructions. There's information that is marked in different ways, or it's redundant information in the sense that the same feature of the sentence is presented in different parts of the sentence, and so this sort of process of seeing that the ending of the verb doesn't agree with the subject, and then correcting that is like something you can do more or less automatically. I think he's a little bit skeptical of how feasible it would be for machines to do that kind of thing. But of course, we know now that you can, any sort of word processing software will do that pretty, the simpler cases of, like verb subject agreement, it can handle pretty well. It isn't that great about more complicated things, I find, but in any case, these sort of like simple correction tasks where there's like a clear mistake and then, one clear solution or one clear correct version of what you mistakenly wrote. Those kinds of things are pretty straightforward for like a machine processing system to handle. And then he also talks about a kind of like number problem. It looks sort of similar to like a Sudoku kind of problem where there's like a sequence of numbers and one of them is missing and you have to fill in the missing number based on the pattern of the other numbers. This kind of thing is also pretty straightforward for probably actually even better. Like machines would probably be better at this than humans would. And in some respects, this is the same kind of process as inventing a new machine. For example, like you have your steam engine that's doing whatever, and it keeps having this kind of breakdown, and you sort of realize that you need to add such and such a part to prevent the breakdown from happening. And so like filling in this missing part is kind of a more complicated or more sophisticated version of filling in the missing number in a Sudoku puzzle. So on the one hand, there is this kind of continuity between like correcting an error, filling in a missing part, a missing number, a missing word in a sentence, etc. And then what we would consider to be creative or inventive intellectual processes. But then there's also a kind of I guess discontinuity in the sense that the machines that are capable of doing these like correcting an error or filling in the missing number type of problems, these machines are always the product of a kind of inventive thought or inventive intellectual act. A machine never, there's never been a case where an error correcting, a machine that corrects typos sort of invented itself, or was invented by another machine. And even if that were the case, the first machine would still have to be invented by a person. So at some point, no matter how far back you go in this sort of process of machines being built by machines, you would end up with a person who decides that building a machine that makes other machines was a good idea. So yeah, there's this continuity on the one hand. The invention is sort of a more sophisticated version of this, filling in the blanks kind of problem. But then on the other hand, there's a kind of ontological distinction between this kind of autonomous invention, the person who invents something or who decides to build something, and then on the other hand, the functioning of an already built machine. So yeah, he wants to sort of like go through the kind of intricate relationships between these two aspects of what we would consider invention or creation. Okay, so yeah, we can continue from the top of page 169, which I think is where we are left off last time.
I can read. Information and organization. Cybernetics sometimes seems to hesitate between the word quote-unquote information and the word quote-unquote form. This is natural since one of its fundamental theses is the closeness, if not identification, of information and negentropy, all specific form, in opposition to fortuitous disorder or to a domain of variability, represents negentropy. In every information message is a specific form in transmission and, if we can put it this way, in mission. Everyone seems to agree on this point. Coffignon, Bonsac, Cliouin, I think, and Costa de Beauregard. Quote, nothing obliges us to limit ourselves to some messages. We can understand these notions, the variability of a system and the specificity of a certain form, in any system and any form whatsoever. Thus, a mosaic or an embroidery can be described, by counting some cases, as a sort of message of which the alphabet would be the range of colors and the specific form. Similarly, Brillouin claims, quote, if information represents negentropy, it is the same for organization. We now begin to see the relation with life. A living system is organized, unquote. Similarly, again, Costa de Beauregard considers organization as information in the Aristotelian sense of active information, and he asks that we accept, quote, in a similarly realist sense, unquote, the process of free action, information, arrow, negentropy, just as we accept the process of observation, negentropy, arrow, information. One must nevertheless be aware of the danger of speaking of quote, any form whatever, unquote, or of quote unquote negentropy in general. The word quote unquote organization is preferable. Of course, the mosaic, if not the embroidery, could be produced by the play of physical forces. Artists today, we know, utilize a lot of chance. Its form would not appear to be less specific. We have spent billions to have some photographs of the lunar surface, as if the meteorite craters there formed a precious tableau. But true specificity, true form, implies an organization. For a statue, as for a message, there must be a third element, something, quote, transcendent in relation to the system, unquote, which intervenes to put it in a well-defined state. It is only then, quote, that it has a true specificity in relation to all possible states, unquote. A well-coordinated crystal is not, quote, specific in this sense, unquote, any more than a soap bubble or a liquid steam system at a certain pressure. It results from a physical equilibrium. We know the misuse to which the notion of feedback or retroaction has been put by confusing it with simple physical equilibrium, which has resulted in the absorption of all physical phenomena of equilibrium into cybernetics. A star does not pulsate through controlled, self-regulated oscillations like a steam engine equipped with a watt regulator. A cave does not truly regulate its temperature like an air conditioner. True cybernetic or biological organization demands a true regulation at the level of active command. It is only then that the resulting form of this command can be put on the same plane as an information message. It results from it. Once again, cybernetics is inseparable from finality. Active regulation in a thermostat, for example, operates according to a true quote unquote message with a semantics. If the thermostat's control mechanism is set at 18 degrees, it is not necessarily 18 degrees. It represents this temperature, and as a result, it contributes to producing or quote unquote realizing it, like an end that determines its means. Organization cannot be confused with pure and simple negative. This means that without exception, all organization, like all messages, are directly or indirectly the work of things. Mechanical cybernetic arrangements are material, actual. They operate mechanically, but they come from a living being. It's the living person who, through interposed control, acts like the indispensable, quote unquote, third element, quote, transcendent in relation to the system, unquote. And yet the ambition of cyberneticians is to understand living and conscious beings according to cybernetic models. The vicious circle is clear. The living organism explains in reality the cybernetic apparatuses. Then the cybernetic apparatuses are presented in science as explaining living organism. If we insist on applying cybernetic schemas to living beings and even man, then we will inevitably return to the excessively broad sense of the notion of feedback or retroaction. The living being will be a self-regulated form, but like a soap bubble or a pulsating star, not like a thermostat or a regulating machine. In sum, an inauthentic cybernetics will be an indispensable source of authentic cybernetics. The living person gives a meaning, but he does not have a meaning. He organizes, but he is not truly an organism. He chooses an effective model for a machine by comparing plans, but he himself results not from a choice, but from a mechanical and blind natural selection. He invents, but he has not himself been invented. Yeah, so it seems like I almost said Simondon. Ruyer is drawing a hard distinction between physical equilibrium or negentropy, which includes apparently crystallization. Obviously, Simondon's favorite example of physical individuation, distinguishing that from organization, which does involve some kind of some kind of feedback system that is not merely a system reaching a physical equilibrium. So, like a cave that happens to stay at the same temperature can't be characterized as controlling its temperature by feedback in the way that a thermometer would use feedback to regulate the temperature of a room or a air conditioning unit equipped with a thermometer. And then cybernetics kind of gets it backwards by failing to see, from Ruyer's perspective, that feedback presupposes some kind of third-person perspective or frame, which is always, vital in some sense, which sets up the cybernetic machines in the first place and is maybe for Ruyer like the reason there are homeostatic mechanisms in the living being to begin with. So, temperature regulation would be something that is used by a living system in order to maintain itself at a distinct equilibrium from its environment, and in that sense would be kind of subordinate to the frame of being.
Yeah, I think we can connect this passage with some debates in like philosophy of biology about what exactly a function is, or what we mean by a function. So like there, a sort of like naive or sort of immediate understanding of living organisms attributes functions to the various organs or systems within those organisms. So like a heart is for pumping blood, wings are for flying, etc. But what exactly we mean when we say that is not that clear, even though it's often relatively straightforward to agree or like you can have scientists who will study an organ and agree or disagree about what the function is, but what exactly they mean by function is not always clear, even when they have a straightforward understanding of what what the function of this organ is. So in a sort of like intelligent design sort of creationist perspective, you could just say the function of the organ is what the creator of this organism wanted it to be able to do. Of course, most biologists are not going to adopt that line, at least in the 20th, 21st century. From an evolutionary perspective, it's more complicated or harder to understand what exactly we might mean by the function of an organ. So there have been attempts to try to present this in evolutionary terms and saying that like the function of an organ is sort of the has to do with what advantage it confers to that organism. So organisms that have a heart have, say, better circulation of blood than those that don't, and therefore the function of the heart is to circulate blood. I mean, this is a very sort of oversimplified account of what this would look like. And one sort of difficulty of this is that it's often the case that the whatever advantage an organ, the presence of this organ might confer to that organism, there may be many different kinds of advantage. So in the case of like blood circulation, there's circulating the oxygenated blood, allowing the blood to pass through the lungs and then be oxygenated and then pass through the rest of the body, etc. That's one sort of aspect of what the blood circulation is doing. But then, of course, there are hormones that are circulated through the bloodstream. It's a kind of sort of communication system within the body. The blood circulation is not just one sort of function. It does many things for an organism. And also these, what exactly an organ does in this lineage of organisms can change over evolutionary history, where for example, feathers in birds, the sort of standard account of their evolution is they were probably for heat regulation originally, that they would have evolved as a kind of insulation layer, and it was only much later that they became these sort of specialized aerodynamic mechanisms that we know in birds today. So is the function of the feathers defined by what they do for birds now or by what they originally arose to do, etc. Anyway, so the point of all this is that when we're dealing with living beings, it's often quite difficult to say what exactly the sort of mechanisms that we're looking at are actually for. Like what is it that they're doing? You can often give some explanation, say this organ, this system, whatever it is doing X, and X is good for this organism in some way. But it's quite different than in the case of machines, where you can. I mean, the machine is designed by a person to do something, and then the various parts or elements of the machine are meant to ensure that the machine does what the person wants it to do. So in this case, there's so in the case of the organism, you have something, you can look at them as if they were designed, and even Darwinian biologists will sometimes talk about the design of a certain organism and say describe natural selection as if it were something like a designer. But of course, this is sort of an analogy or like a way of speaking, and no one who is thinking about this seriously would say that natural selection really is designing organisms. But in the case of machines, then there is a real design process, of course. So Ruyer points out that when you try to explain the living organisms purely in cybernetic terms, you end up in a kind of circle, because the sort of the case of designing a machine, it's always a living being who is designing these machines. Humans are living beings. But then if you want to explain the functioning of that living being, the human designer, in terms of machine processes, you're sort of taking the product of that living being as the model to explain the producer of that living being. The producer of that machine. So he's kind of insisting on the fact that in cybernetics, there always has to be this real semantic, this sort of message character. So when you set a thermostat to 18 degrees or whatever number, you are sort of sending a message to the device, even if it's a very simple message of, a number 18. Whereas, some other, natural system like this cave that, say, like through some sort of like, chance of geology ends up having this kind of thermally self-regulating character to it. There was no message that was sort of sent to this cave, keep the temperature at this level. And so trying to explain away this kind of this character or this capacity that humans have of understanding meaning, sending meaningful messages, etc., to explain that in terms of these non-meaningful processes is kind of like, again, is kind of circular or like self-defeating approach. Well, maybe the solution is just to go back to the external teleology that people like Hegel make fun of, that the function of the nose is to put glasses on and so on, and everything is made for specific human purposes. Okay, so I'll read the next bit. Cybernetics and biological morphogenesis. The mechanist interpretation is absurd, with its claim to reduce all regulations to mechanical regulations, when in fact they are extracted from quote-unquote ideal or quote-unquote valuing regulations. Cybernetics, understood as the finality of machines, is not limited to an inauthentic cybernetics of pure physical equilibria. There may be a larger cybernetics encompassing the space of mechanisms and the transspatial domain of values and meanings, one controlling the other, which in turn, quote-unquote, realizes it in space through feedback. In order to understand the morphogenesis and persistence of organisms, it is indispensable to consider that every living being is double, situated between two worlds, participating in space and in trans-space, such that it can play the double role of quote-unquote assembling and of quote-unquote assembly. I don't have the French text in front of me here, but I think this assembly, I think he's using the word montage, something like that here. Anyway, I'll have to check that later. There are physiological feedbacks that only operate mechanically or chemically, and there are machines regulated internally that are present in all the organisms, superior to viruses and single-celled organisms, as Cannon, Wiener, Stanley Jones, and other physiologists have demonstrated. But physiology is not the whole of biology. It results from secondary assemblies. What is the agent of these assemblies? What is the active principle of morphogenesis or organogenesis? Although cybernetics has always had a good relationship with physiology, it was born, in fact, from a crossing of physiology and mechanics. Attempts by mechanist cybernetics to address either the morphogenesis of the individual or of the species seem so far to have led to a dead end. I'm going to keep going because this is like a very short section. The morphogenesis of the individual. An idea of Ferdinand Gonset is very illuminating here. He emphasizes that there are two senses of the word ébauche. I'll explain here. So ébauche in French means something like sketch, but he's going to explain these meanings here. He emphasizes that there are two senses of the word ébauche, a weak and a strong one. It bears a weak sense when it is a first stage toward the realization of a final form that is known in advance or already exists somewhere and is essentially a sketch of the reproduction of an existing model. It has a strong sense when the draftsman, while being aware of being haunted by a vague idea, has no external or internal model and does not know in advance what will come from its first realizations, which are steps towards something not yet defined. Now, the embryonic formulation of a living being has something paradoxical about it. It needs to be classified as an ébauche in the quote-unquote weak sense developed by Gonset. The finished structure, its adult version, exists somewhere. As we say, the formation is an event of reproduction. And yet, upon close examination of the epigenetic nature of development, the embryonic stages rather resemble a series of ébauches in the strong sense. Evidently, the formation does not copy anything. Experimental embryology confirms this. There are necessarily improvised regulations with only thematic orientations toward a designable organ, first without precision as cephalic or dorsal or caudal, quote-unquote determinations, but with indeterminate content. As for the ébauche in the weak sense, development at first appears to be explainable by cybernetics and mechanist models of controlling and programming material. The recent discoveries of the role of nucleic acids and their quote-unquote messages encoded in base sequences, as well as the role of their quote-unquote messengers, which are the ribonucleic acids that enter the cellular protoplasm to construct specific proteins, have turned the idea that the entire organism is built on a genetic quote-unquote organogram into a dogma. It is believed that all its adult forms are inscribed in a coded form in the information contained in the genes of the initial cell, and that mechanisms of the cybernetic type, with various subordinate mechanisms and positive and negative feedback loops, ensure the transition from genetic information to the adult form, that is, from the program to its realization. It is striking to see that embryologists, on the contrary, seem uncomfortable, while of course welcoming the discoveries of geneticists. This is because their experiments keep imposing on them the idea of the ébauche in the strong sense, which is incompatible with the notion of a fully predetermined program. One of the latest attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable, without mentioning that of Dr. Sauvant, which remains at the level of generalities, and for conceiving, quote, the cybernetics of development, unquote, is the title of chapter 2 of his book, is that of C.H. Waddington. It essentially consists in the metaphor of the epigenetic landscape. It can be represented as shown in figure 10.3. So here the diagram is it's like a sheet sort of suspended with I guess sort of bumpy shape, and then there's a marble on it, and then so the idea is that the marble is going to roll down this sheet, but it will pass through these different sort of valleys in the sheet rather than over the bumps, and so the bumps are kind of or like the wavy or the wavy character of the sheet is sort of determined by some sort of structure underneath the sheet, which is labeled genes. The ball, representing the state of the primordium ébauche, is not guided by rails but by valleys more or less open, with thresholds, branches, and plateaus, where it can hesitate on its path and then be determined by the action of a gene that helps it pass a threshold. It can accidentally, or through the intervention of the embryologist, leave the bottom of a valley, but it returns there through quote unquote homeoresis rather than homeostasis, since it is in movement. What then is the role of the genetic program? This program is represented by the strings from which hang the genes G, pulling the surface from the beginning, determining its bumps and valleys, and which can also deform it along the way through delayed intervention. Seems to be more a matter of disguised preformation than of epigenesis. Program is everything, and the ball has no initiative of its own. Okay, I'll finish this section. Actually, no, I'll stop here because there's a couple more pages. Okay. So this is, it's sort of building, or sort of in contrast to a lot of the biological research, molecular biology specifically of this time. So this is, shortly after the first discovery of the structure of DNA and the role of DNA in heredity. And of course, this was sort of like obviously this is an extremely important discovery, but it also, for a long time, was kind of overemphasized or oversimplified, in the sense that there was this idea that, and you still hear this language now, is that that DNA is sort of the blueprint of the organism, and the hope at that time of some geneticists or molecular biologists was that you would just be able to, at some point, like, read off the adult organism from the DNA. And this, of course, turned out to be, an extreme oversimplification, because the developmental process is very complicated and is not sort of determined by the DNA alone. So the sort of coding structure that we know in DNA has to do with it sort of produces templates of proteins. Is more or less what it is. Is that you have a sequence of 3 base pairs, corresponds to an amino acid. So it has this kind of like alphabet character, which is quite surprising, I think, that in the sense that this is an arbitrary association as far as anyone can tell. There's no reason why there's no sort of intrinsic reason why this particular sequence of 3 base pairs should correspond to this specific amino acid, or why it couldn't be set up in such a way that this sequence of base pairs would correspond to some other amino acid. It seems to be just sort of an arbitrary association, in the same way that particular letter shapes and particular sounds are associated in an arbitrary way in human writing systems. But at the same time, it's also shared by all organisms that we know of. That, like, this association between a sequence of base pairs and a particular amino acid is the same across all living organisms. So it's arbitrary but also universal, which is pretty interesting. And then so this sequence of base pairs determines a sequence of amino acids, and this sequence of amino acids makes up a protein. Plus the folding of this protein, which is itself a pretty complicated process. So a protein has a three-dimensional structure, even though the DNA only determines a one-dimensional structure, a sort of chain of amino acids. And then, of course, the even bigger problem here is that every cell, more or less, in the organism's body has the same DNA, leaving out the reproductive cells. But of course, we have dozens or hundreds of different cell types in, say, a human body. You have muscle cells, neurons, bone cells, liver cells, et cetera, that are all using the same DNA, but they all have very different structures and functions. And so we know that there has to be something that sort of regulates what these cells are doing with that DNA, and this turns out to be extremely complicated, and I think not even that well understood now. But in the development of an embryo, there are processes that sort of turn on and turn off the expression of these different genes. So the one segment of the genome that says produce this type of protein will get it is allowed to produce to be used to produce that protein in one cell, but then in another cell it will be sort of blocked from production, and then the output of one of these processes will sort of feed back into the regulation of a different process that will either turn on or off certain genes, etc. So yeah, this very complicated network of regulation of all these different genes that results in a differentiated body plan. So these proteins that are sort of determined by the structure of the genome are obviously essential elements of making up an organism, but on their own they don't say anything about where different genes should be turned on or turned off, and what the sort of overall structure of that organism should be. And then maybe even more fundamentally, just as a last note, is that of course DNA on its own doesn't actually do anything. It's like partly the whole sort of reason why DNA is like useful to living organisms is precisely because it is stable and more or less inert. Proteins do things. They interact with other proteins and different chemicals in the body and produce results of some kind. But of course, in that process, they're used up or undergo transformations. But the DNA, part of what makes it useful as this sort of template function is the fact that it doesn't really do anything on its own. So this sort of I guess valuation of DNA as like the essence of life or something like that is sort of like missing the point that the DNA is like more or less inert, and it's only inside a cell that has all kinds of other machinery that takes the DNA and uses it as a template to produce proteins. It's only in that context that this DNA is actually of any interest. Otherwise, it's just a chemical that sits there and doesn't really do anything. And so this is why in some cases you can take a mammoth that's been buried in permafrost for 70,000 years or whatever and extract DNA from it, whereas like all kinds of other chemicals in the body of this organism have been degraded or have undergone various transformations. You can still extract DNA from this long dead organism precisely because it doesn't really do anything. So the short version, DNA obviously extremely important in how living organisms work, but on its own is not really explaining it is not capable of explaining the functioning of a living organism as a whole.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as a historical note that Ruyer was making this argument, as you noted, kind of in the early days of like this intense focus on the genome as kind of the whole explanation of how the organism comes about and beer and all this stuff. And that developments in molecular biology since the 90s have kind of come around closer to something like Ruyer's position, at least in that, as you noted, it's now not at all clear that it doesn't seem to be the case that the central dogma with the kind of one gene, one protein, one function picture of how life works is a realistic understanding of embryogenesis or life in general.
Yeah, there's the point that you mentioned in the chat here about how you can. So often you have like a sequence, say like 1,000 base pairs or whatever, that is not just sort of one template for one protein. It's not just that this sequence of 1,000 base pairs equals this protein, but that sequence is kind of like it's almost like multiple different protein templates all sort of written on top of each other, and then depending on where the different splicing points are, you can sort of cut a segment out of it to make one protein code, and then take a different segment out of it to make a different protein code. It's like, imagine if you sort of like wrote a book where like each sentence was like embedded in a bigger sentence, and then you could just sort of like extract different sentence segments out of this one giant sentence. That's sort of like how these sort of overwritten protein codes are structured. So it's not even just that this one sequence it corresponds to one protein. It's that like these the biological machinery within the cell sort of selects segments out of one sort of strand of DNA, based on, again, these extremely complicated sort of regulatory processes that determine when certain proteins get produced, when certain genes get expressed, etc., and then when other ones don't. So it's like sort of cutting out a segment and then splicing different things together and so on in these extremely complicated ways to produce a certain protein that has a certain effect based on certain triggering factors or inhibitory factors that all sort of interact with each other in these intricate ways. And it's sort of an aside, but I think it's interesting to talk about here. So it's something we were just discussing in the chat, is that so like viruses in as we know them today. So the way they work in general is that they it's generally like a section of RNA or DNA sort of encased in a protein of some kind, and it sort of works its way into a cell, and then kind of hijacks the machinery of the cell to produce more copies of itself. So the cell, rather than sort of building the normal proteins and stuff that it's supposed to be doing using its own DNA, starts taking the DNA or the RNA from the virus and making copies of that instead. And then, of course, each of these new copies of the virus can spread. In origin of life research, there's sort of like two big like traditions or approaches, and it's sort of like the replicator first versus metabolism first sort of approaches, because sort of when we look at living organisms now, there's sort of two key properties that they seem to have. Is that, of course, they replicate themselves, that a chicken lays eggs that turn into other chickens, an oak tree produces acorns that turn into other oak trees, etc. And then also metabolism, in the sense that they take in energy and materials from the environment and assimilate them into their own bodies and use them for their continued life process. But then the question is, which one of these comes first? One of them, it seems like one of them would have to have come first, and then the other one sort of added on afterwards. And so one of these approaches, the replicator first, sort of takes it that like DNA or RNA replicators would have sort of arisen first, so they would be something like the viruses that we know today, and then somehow afterwards some of these replicators would have sort of attributed to themselves, have sort of developed from themselves the capacity to control the flow of chemicals, across a membrane, for example, um, distinguishes an inside from an outside, and of course doing so in such a way that they are more successful at replicating than the other replicators, and therefore spreading throughout the environment and eventually becoming what we know as living organisms today that have both replication and metabolism. So yeah, I mean, this is obviously very speculative. There's no sort of confirmed. There's no way of sort of proving this theory as things stand now. But yeah, one approach to origin of life sees something like a virus as the sort of first step that only later acquires the capacity to to regulate flows of chemicals in what we would see as something like metabolism in current living organisms. Okay, so we can go on from 173, pure geneticists.
I can read again unless anybody else wants to read.
I can read if y'all can hear me.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Pure geneticists strongly advocate preformation and strict programming without the intervention of equilibrium of any kind. But can we then still speak of cybernetics? The reaction between the large molecules of enzymes are entirely different to ordinary chemical reactions, which find their equilibrium thanks to thermal agitation. Nucleic acids precisely control the sequencing of amino acids. Quote, "This is a mechanism as strict as a clockwork movement." Jacques Monod has even spoken of a neo-Cartesianism of genetics. What he means by it is that the organism no longer appears today as a dynamic equilibrium, which would only have the type of stability of a steady-state flame with a constant flow of materials, but as a sort of domino game with a strict spatial structuralism. Cybernetics would only appear in a way that is entirely residual, through genes or parts of genes that exist beside structural genes and are inaccurately called regulatory. These act like repressors insofar as they block the activity of the operator genes. It is difficult to think that this is the introduction of the cybernetic concept of feedback at the molecular level. The repressor, or the operon, is purely structural, like a cap on a bottle. It adapts itself to certain sites of the molecular structure, which it blocks or unblocks. However, a coaptation has never passed for a feedback equilibrium. It is true that there remains the idea of code, which evokes cybernetics, but after a lot of enthusiasm, the cyberneticists have realized that the choice of this word has not been very adequate. The correspondence between the base triplets and the 20 amino acids is imprecise. Above all, we do not see where and who the decoder would be. Finally, the molecular structures do not signify. They act directly. Like keys or plugs, they act through their field. Some English researchers, such as S.R. Pelk and M.G.E. Welton, have without doubt made the final blow against the metaphor of the code by discovering that the correspondence between the triplets and the amino acids is not arbitrary like that of a sign to the signified. The three base triplets assembled in space fit together or correspond spatially at a distance with the acid that determines the triplet. But we are increasingly unable to see the connection between this domino game, where the dominoes fit together according to their physical shape rather than by a player's reading of them, and the epigenetic developments of embryogenesis, where on the contrary, the causes appear to be signals. Waddington, in a recent book, expresses his concerns. Molecular genetics can only claim to explain the macrostructures of the adult. Quote, "Some structures essential for cellular development, revealed by the electron microscope, already do not appear like the direct product of the gene-enzyme systems, but rather as secondary elaborations." We can say the same thing, and even more so, about macrostructures. The chemical explanation by the inducers explains nothing. What counts is the response of tissues, their competence, as the embryologists say, reacting to the quote signals of the inducer. We would say that it is their own semantemes, simply awakened by the signals. Waddington protests against the exclusive enthusiasm for molecular genetics and calls for greater effort at the fringes of fundamental embryology. To sum up, mechanist cybernetics fails in every way in biology except physiology naturally. A. There is no mechanico-chemical feedback in development. Development is paradoxically a reproductive epigenesis. It is conceivable as a regulated invention. It requires the hypothesis of a control and a feedback of some sort, but a control transversal to space with a thematic character. The chemical substances of, quote, inducers appear to be only the, quote, supports of a semantics. B, on the other hand, it fails again when it considers development to be strictly programmed according to a genetic code. The American physicist Walter M. Elasser is consistent with the suggestions of Niels Bohr, Pascal Jordan, and Brillouin, and goes against Erwin Schrödinger's theses, in demonstrating that it would be arbitrary to postulate a passage from information stored in the genes to the structure of the adult, which would be determinist in the sense of classical physics. The idea of a Laplacian observer who would verify this new preformationism by inquiring about the way in which the information contained in the molecules of DNA, then of RNA, determine large-scale organization through various intermediaries, remains in the domain of pure unverifiable theory. Just as much as the idea of telegraphing a man over a distance by examining his molecular structures and coding them into a message, which a receiver would decode in reconstituting the man, as Brillouin has demonstrated. As for the chess-playing automaton, the operation of calculators and electronic readers, even at fantastic speed, would take more than 100 centuries in the best hypothesis. The, quote, stored program of genetics is like a book that everyone swears is extremely interesting, but that no one has ever been able to read, and of which it could be proven that no one could ever read. Might be a good spot to stop, I'm not sure. It's about a page left.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I lost track of where we were.
I stopped at the end of B, at the bottom of
Oh,
174.
yeah. Maybe can you just read the next page because then we get to a section break.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah, thanks.
Note that it is not the structure of some chains or helices of DNA that is unobservable, or the event of their duplication or their molding. It is the determinist dependence of the organic structure on the adult, on these DNA structures, which are supposed to command it or to contain it in nunts. However, numerous indications show that observable large organisms with their primary and secondary consciousness, meaning that these organisms are absolute surfaces or domains, possessing their own form without needing to observe themselves by scanning from an exterior point, emerge in temporal continuity by gen identity through the virus or other living molecules from microphysical realities. Microphysical domains are, like organisms, domains of delocalization or internal detemporalization. Through their multiplicity, they form classical spacetime with secondary statistical laws, but in themselves they are below these laws, which explains why the large organisms themselves appear to be beyond these laws. We understand very well, then, the failure of cybernetics when confronted with life and consciousness. The cybernetic models all borrow from classical macroscopic physics. They are just as incapable of explaining the lowest living individual as the model of the impact between billiard balls is incapable of explaining the electron, the neutron, and all the elementary particles and their interactions. Cybernetics succeeds in physiology at the level where precisely the living individual uses large statistical phenomena secondarily, at the level of the organic machines that it assembles as internal auxiliaries. Here it is only natural that the cybernetic models, and in general external machines, correspond. The machines, whether internal or external, put to work inorganic materials, or materials derived from the organic domain, channeling the flow of other materials or energy, and sometimes using the currents derived as guiding feedback. We understand just as well how the notion of mechanical feedback, using negentropy to create informative order, loses its usual sense in the domain of microphysics. We can guide a DCA cannon by a radar that observes the target and guides or corrects the aim by stopping the cannon in the right position. This stopping requires a, quote, microscopization of the, quote, disorder. But Maxwell's demon, which is supposed to observe the molecules and choose the faster ones by letting them pass through its trapdoor, in the same way that Szilard's demon, which uses a unique molecule in a cylinder with a piston without the friction that this molecule would generate, cannot stop these molecules by making microscopic a disorder that is already microscopic. Without its author appearing to perceive it clearly, this excellent analysis condemns all microscopic cybernetics, and so every mechanist cybernetic explanation of life. The Maxwellian or Szillardian demons, if we can speak of demons, that work in the elementary organisms to choose molecules and combine them, surely do not work according to the laws of classical physics.
Yeah, so right, this is just building on the previous passage, and yeah, it was sort of what I was talking about earlier about the limitations to demonology. Yeah, gotta bring in the demons. So limitations to the sort of program metaphor that the DNA would be the program that determines development. Or a generally sort of mechanistic model of the living organism. Let me see if there's anything more than that to go over here. Yeah, I'm not sure about this bit about microscopization. What exactly he's getting at here? So the bit about the cannon or the anti-aircraft gun. So the idea here is that when you apply a brake to the rotation of the anti-aircraft gun, you're taking the macroscopic movement of the gun as a whole, and then when you apply the brake, you're turning that macroscopic movement into heat, which is, of course, a microscopic movement of the particles that make up the brake and the rest of the machine that the heat gets transferred to. So you're taking this macroscopic sort of ordered movement of the whole gun rotating around a certain axis, and then you're turning it into this disordered movement of all the different particles, which is what constitutes heat. I'm not sure exactly what. Yeah, so he talks about this other sort of thought experiment, which I'm not familiar with, Szillard's demon. Probably have to look at that to see what exactly that has to do with this microscopization concept. I guess the idea here is that when we talk about regulation phenomena in machines, like macroscopic machines, it always involves this use of a lower level microscopic statistical regulation. So he talks in earlier chapters. He talked about like a tube, for example, as a kind of device that takes the the many particles of water or whatever it is that are moving around in various directions and makes them flow in one direction or in a limited sort of angle of flow. All these sort of cybernetic regulatory processes in a machine rely on a lower level statistical sort of operation. So it relies on regulating the flow of order or disorder at a lower level. But then if we are talking about like the microscopic processes, we don't have a lower level to rely on. And so we sort of run into a problem of what exactly is being regulated by this kind of process. So it seems like we need something, a kind of immediate production of order that is not a regulation of disorder at a more fundamental level. I think that might be what he's getting at here, but I'm not entirely sure without having seen this, the thought experiment that he's referring to here. So we need a demonologist to explain this for us.
One thing that the end of this section kind of clarified for me was that Ruyer has talked about statistical phenomena at a few points in this book, and I wasn't sure whether he was claiming that these macroscopic phenomena are sort of statistical in themselves, and it seems to me that the idea is something like the microscopic phenomena are kind of in themselves non-statistical and characterized by these true form or true formation processes. And then the macroscopic phenomena is kind of statistical for some, surface or absolute survey. perspective of a larger scale living being, although it's still not really clear to me what the surface or absolute survey is supposed to be. And I guess it seems like these microscopic phenomena are kind of macroscopically statistical for a living being rather than kind of being statistical in themselves, which would be kind of a wonky epistemological position to me.
Yeah, I guess maybe what we would need to be able to get a clear sense of what's going on here is some sort of account of what these different levels of organization are that he's talking about. So of course we can distinguish, say, like within a biological organism, you have like a cell maybe is one level of organization, and then you have molecules within that cell. That might be like another level of organization. And of course, the cell, for example, uses the properties of these molecules to allow certain chemicals to diffuse across the gradient, across the cell membrane, flowing down the gradient of concentration, and then also has these sort of pumps in its membrane when it needs to transport molecules against the gradient. So like taking it, for example, pumping out some chemical that builds up within the cell. It needs to pump it out. It's maybe like a byproduct that would be toxic if it reached a concentration that was too high, and it can't rely on diffusion to ensure that it stays low enough, so it has to pump it out. Or on the other direction, it might require some like in the case of neurons, they use sodium and potassium pumps to generate an electric charge. And other ions. So there are all these sort of mechanisms in the cell that rely on like making the movements of these molecules follow a certain tendency rather than a different one that would be more likely if those mechanisms didn't exist. But yeah, it's not 100% clear to me what exactly constitutes the cell as a level of organization distinct from the molecular level. How do we, like, if we're looking at entities in the world, how do we identify what the levels of organization are in those entities? And then, independently of our capacity to recognize which levels of organization there are, that presumably there's something about the cell itself that, makes it a level of organization for itself in some way, that, the cell sort of treats itself as a level of organization that is distinct from the flow of molecules that it uses to persist as a level of organization. So I'm not sure that this book gives us an account of what those levels of organization are. But yeah, maybe that's something we can find in other books that we hopefully will get to, other Ruyer books. I was just skipping ahead, and I realized we're actually pretty close to the end of this book. We probably will finish next week. So yeah, maybe we can just read the one short section, Morphogenesis of Species, and end there, and then read the conclusion of the conclusion next time.
That sounds good to me. I can read the next section. The Morphogenesis of Species. Interestingly enough, although there was an excessive haste to incorporate cybernetic models into the morphogenesis of the individual, that urge was abstained from when it came to the morphogenesis of the species. According to neo-Darwinism and genetics, this morphogenesis is the work of unidirectional mutations without any recurrent guidance from the results of these mutations. This is because there is no inheritance of acquired characteristics through which the needs of adaptation to the environment would be able to guide the mutations in turn. Living species do not adapt. They are transformed by chance genetic mutations, in that they are inferior to the machina docilis, the homeostat, or the Cannon's radar. Genetic mutations produce arbitrary adult structures, and species only adapt to the environment at the cost of the enormous eliminations of natural selection without true regulation. Species are even inferior to the machina labyrinthia, since in the latter, the correct path is recorded in memory and control mechanisms on the basis of successful attempts. This thesis is perfectly implausible, and this implausibility is increasingly troubling to the biologists. We will mention only one well-established fact. It is often observed that a particular environment induces some phenotypic, that is, non-hereditary, modifications in a species that are adaptive, and which exactly resemble aberrant forms of the same species that are genetically induced and fixed. More generally, besides these hereditary characteristics of which we do not see how they would be able to result from an active and self-regulated adaptation, for example, the transparency of the cornea, there are others that exactly resemble the results of this type of adaptation. For example, the callosity of the underside of the ostrich to the place where the animal squats. In addition, after having rejected Lysenko and the Soviet school, a lot of Western biologists today are working to reintroduce the idea of a control feedback coming from individual adaptation and modifying the genes, which thus would not work blindly and in a single direction. But currently, the models proposed according to the mechanist postulates are quite unconvincing. It seems once again that one, feedbacks or couplings of some sort are indispensable, and two, these feedbacks cannot be exclusively mechanical. Yeah, my opinion is this is another take on genetics that has aged well. In that book I was reading a while ago by Philip Ball on molecular biology, he points out several examples of these kind of non-genetic, or I guess you could say causal centers within the organism or the cell that are not, that are distinct from the genome in some way. So, like the behavior of large numbers of intrinsically disordered proteins, because these proteins are disordered, and it's not at all clear to me how this comes about, but something about the interaction of large numbers of disordered proteins produces its own kind of order, which in some cases is involved in the translation and transcription process itself. And so one of Ball's arguments was that it's a kind of adaptationist, anti-pan adaptationist argument that it's beneficial to the species to kind of offload these decision-making processes effectively, so that they operate at different scales and not exclusively kind of bottom up from the level of the genome. And, to the point about some kind of environment to gene influence, in the case of like histone modification and, other epigenetic environmental effects, it's not disputed that environmental changes can change the way the genome itself is expressed, which is, I think, especially interesting in the case of human beings where, stress can kind of epigenetically affect gene expression, and stress can have like a kind of purely symbolic cause. So, you can be stressed out about, I don't know, you can be stressed out about work, for instance, and the work-related, more obviously symbolic stress can affect the way that the genes in your body are expressed. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that it is not exclusively this kind of bottom-up, unidirectional causal process.
Yeah, so this has to do with this sort of big controversy late 19th, early 20th century related to the mechanisms of evolution, and specifically the question of whether there's such a thing as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So this idea that there is inheritance of acquired characteristics was often identified with Lamarck, so it's like described as Lamarckianism, which is not entirely accurate because that's not really that wasn't really the main point of his theory of evolution. It was sort of like he wanted to sort of explain like he considered this sort of like a side element of the general account of evolution. So his main theory had to do with this sort of striving of organisms, that there was this kind of like striving that leads up from the lower, quote unquote, lower organisms, towards humans, of course, being the most perfect of the organisms. And then he wanted to, like, there are organisms that are sort of off the main line of this striving that are sort of particular to one kind of environment or mode of life. And he saw this sort of inheritance of acquired characteristics as an explanation for, how they sort of became specialized to this, mode of life. The electrons were not striving enough, I guess. So anyway, so at the end of the 19th century, there was this, debate about whether there is such a thing as inheritance of acquired characteristics, and what came to be known as sort of neo-Darwinism, that sort of formed at that time, was based on the rejection of this possibility. And it's interesting also to note that Darwin himself was not a Darwinist in that sense. So in The Origin of Species, in the first edition, he presents his account of the mechanism of natural selection. But then in later editions, he sort of adds in more stuff, and including passages where he does accept the inheritance of acquired characteristics as another mechanism of evolution in addition to natural selection. And then so the neo-Darwinists kind of purged all that stuff out of the account of evolution, and wanted to say they wanted to sort of make it a purely natural selection account of evolution. And so that was after several decades of back and forth, that ended up becoming sort of the dominant account of evolution in, I guess, like the mid 20th century, roughly. And then towards the end of the 20th century, there was more and more sort of problem cases that, that a lot of them were not sort of new things, but it just sort of like more of these things started coming up, and more people started to be interested in, how to handle them. So epigenetics is one sort of big sort of category of these types of things. So like Angus was talking about, the methylation of DNA, for example. So in the DNA strands in a living organism, some of them are sort of coiled up tightly and not accessible to the machinery that produces proteins, and then other parts of it are sort of more stretched out so that they are accessible to the protein production machinery. And the sort of chemical processes that bring about this coiling or stretching out are themselves, so firstly are susceptible to environmental influence, in the sense that like the stress example, that an organism that is stressed will have a certain characteristic pattern of methylation of coiling or stretching of segments of their DNA. And that pattern is heritable. So it's not the sequence of base pairs in the DNA itself that changes as a result of the experience of the organism over the course of its lifespan, but the pattern of methylation that regulates which elements of the genome will get expressed. That pattern is heritable. So this is like a whole sort of area of research that I think maybe in the last like 30 years or so has been explored. And there's lots of other things that don't really fit that well into this sort of neo-Darwinian synthesis. I don't think there's really been like sort of one theory that sort of replaces the neo-Darwinian synthesis that sort of accounts for all these things, that is like kind of a consensus theory. But there's more sort of openness now, I think, to evolution not being identifiable or reducible just to natural selection. That there's more going on than just natural selection, or natural selection is not enough to account for everything. And of course, you have to sort of distinguish this from the intelligent design types of arguments that say, like, we need to suppose that there's a creator of some kind because natural selection is not enough to account for evolution. And so I think because of that type of argument, that made a lot of biologists more, I guess, reluctant to accept some of these things that sort of challenged the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and they just kind of wanted to resist that kind of line of thought and just sort of insist, yes, Darwinian natural selection is all we need. But that seems to be less. It seems to be less sort of rigid or dogmatic in that respect today. But yeah, it's still, I think, fairly up in the air. What mechanisms of evolution there are that happen. In addition to natural selection, and how they all interact with each other. And how we get from there to the broader history of living organisms that we can observe in the fossil record and DNA evidence and so on over many billions of years, with all the different species and other groupings that arise over time. So yeah, there's still a lot of question marks in this whole picture, but yeah, I think Ruyer was sort of pointing in the right direction, and several decades earlier than most biologists would have really, accepted this kind of thinking. So yeah, and a good a +1 for Ruyer that kind of compensates for the negatives of his underestimation of what machine translation would be able to do, and so on. Okay, so let's end here, and then, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we just have the one section left of this chapter, the section labeled conclusion. So the chapter as a whole is a conclusion, and then this is the conclusion of the conclusion. So we should finish it next time. Hopefully, it's somewhat long. I think we should finish it. And what I had suggested we read as a kind of interlude after this is Canguilhem's text, the Life and Concept, which I think is a good sort of complement to all the things that we have been reading over the last couple of years. I think they all had relations with Canguilhem in various ways. And then the next book that I had suggested we read is Ruyer's other book, Neo-Finalism, which is also translated. So yeah, that's sort of a preview, unless we change our minds. But that's sort of what where we're thinking of going next.
Yeah, both of those sound great to me.
Okay, cool. Thanks everyone for coming out, and hope to see you for the conclusion of the conclusion of the conclusion next time.
Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.